This is the Roller Coaster Podcast, and I'm your host, Lucy Q. Life is a wild ride. It has twists and turns. It's scary, exciting, and downright fun. So throw your head back, arms in the air, and come along with me for the ride.
Life is like a roller coaster, baby, baby. I wanna ride.
Episode 200 of the roller coaster will soon be here, and this is your chance to be part of the fun. I'm going to be recording this episode with coaches and listeners just like you. If you want to be part of the fun, head over to nectargrowth.com. Sign up for free and RSVP for the November 18th event. All of the details will be under the events tab. I can't wait to see you there. What are you waiting for? Come join us. You know you're worth it. Genetic engineering is about to explode. And while many applications will be very positive, we need to be careful, proceeding safely and humanely. We need to question who monitors its application and possibly decides when things go too far. Joining me today is Dr. Mark Ryall, author of Age-Decoded, a novel which explores the many potential effects of genetic engineering technology on the future of humanity. Hi, Mark.
Hello, Lucy, and I just want to say thank you so much for hosting me on the Roller Coaster Podcast.
My pleasure. Now, the subject of your book is really interesting, especially where we are in the world today. Anytime you're talking about playing with somebody's DNA, their genetics, because for me, that's what makes us human. So when you start playing with it, that's when I get uncomfortable. So what really prompted you to write this book?
Yeah, and you're right. This is crossing over into across a threshold between into some other humanness. Unlike all the other technologies, nuclear, information technology, whatever, this technology is the one that is truly going to impact what it means to be human. So what prompted me to write this is it goes way back. My daughter actually started running when she was 8 years old. She just had this innate desire to run, and she's pretty competitive. She still runs in college, so cross country running and track. And so when she was 8, she headed out the door, and you can't really let an 8-year-old run around the city necessarily on her own. So I sort of went out with her and just made sure she knew her way back and whatever. And she wouldn't run too far, but maybe a kilometer or so at that age. And so she got me into running, and then I got into triathloning a little later, and also coaching running in high school, which I really loved. But when in my triathloning, I got pretty serious about it, and I actually earned my way to the World Championships representing Canada for triathlon in my age group. So I was just about to turn 60, and I qualified. So I made it into the 60 to 65-year-old age group, and I was in the younger end of that. And when I was over there in Switzerland during the race or after the race in a pub, some of the guys were joking. Some of the older people in that group, like 64-year-old or whatever, would say to me and to some of the younger ones, you have such a big advantage. You're 4 years younger. And it really struck me how, I don't know how someone in their 60s could distinguish and feel that difference. But I also did notice myself that as I ran in my 50s, and now at the age, I'm 61 now, that I have slowed down. There is, if you study the physiology, it's about a 1% decline in performance per year, which sort of, after 4 years, that's 4%, which is about a minute on a 10K run. So you do feel the decline. And we're basically growing old, and even though we're fairly fit athletes, and we are approaching death as humans. So I became fascinated in this topic. I started looking into the whole idea of performance, aging. And then I discovered that there was a lot of research in the world going on, very serious research, not science fiction, about anti-aging and maybe even stopping aging. And what really blew my mind is reversing aging. So I don't really hold out too much hope that it'll happen in my lifetime, but there does seem to be a lot going on in that area, and it's all in a lot of it entails genetic engineering. So that's sort of what led into my book. A couple steps from my daughter when she was 8 years old, getting me into athletics, and then me being curious about aging, the effect on athletics, and then finding out that there's a lot of science out there. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting to see what's possible. And you mentioned nuclear technology. And
Mhm.
yes, and you're in Ontario, and Ontario is powered by nuclear energy.
Much so.
Um, us in Nova Scotia, we are still, I have an oil tank. That's what we have. I
On
have,
coal-fired plants down there, or
yeah, we
coal-fired?
do. We
Do you?
do.
Okay, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, you have the Dartmouth side of the harbor. There's you call them the Three Sisters. They're three towers that are, painted white and red. And it's a cold day when all three are smoking.
Yeah,
It's a
yeah,
cold day.
yeah.
So yeah, Nova Scotia's a little bit sort of behind the times on that. But when you think of, anything nuclear, you for me, I think of nuclear bombs and, what if we've released two and the effects that they had. So
Sure.
I can't help but wonder, sure, well, reverse aging, anti-aging can be very positive things. What are the bad things that can happen?
And I think that's a very good comparison looking at that other technology, nuclear, because on that front, we have used a nuclear bomb, and we've twice, I guess, the US used it. And also we have invested billions, probably trillions in nuclear weapons. So, however, we have, in all fairness, humans and countries have pretty well controlled the use of these nuclear weapons, right from the treaties in the 1960s, the non-proliferation treaties, and now the more recent prohibition treaties, although most that any nations that have nuclear weapons did not sign the prohibition treaty this year. So, but we have at least sort of contained it in a box and kept it from being a huge detriment to society, I think. But that's a very good analogy, though. So you're right on the genetic front. I think it's going to be the same thing. We're going to have to band together as nations, try to bring forward all the positive benefits. There can be so many positive things. We can talk about a few if you want on the medical front and whatnot. But
Yeah, what are some of the things that they are doing, the positive sides of it?
positives are, from what I can see, almost endless. Now, I brought in my book, Age-Decoded, I brought in aging because some people see aging as a disease. Now, I don't necessarily see that as a disease. I see it as sort of a natural process, but many people do. They see aging as a disease that brings on a lot of other problems like diseases like cancer and Alzheimer's and whatnot. So they want to eradicate aging. But let's just go back to some simpler things like, say, cystic fibrosis, the certainly Huntington's disease, a number of visual disorders, heart disease, HIV, all of those things that I've just mentioned. There is serious research going on, and there's two I can mention: the Huntington's and cystic fibrosis. Yes, those two. They feel like they can solve those and eradicate them with genetic engineering because they're fairly simple on the genetic front. They only involve one gene or even maybe just one nucleotide in one. In this case of cystic fibrosis, just one nucleotide where the one pair of nucleotides where the pair is just flipped, and they actually have the technology to flip back a pair of nucleotides right now. So I think Huntington's, which is another horrible affliction. I know a family here in Toronto area that has that gene in their family, and it's horrible. It's I think most people agree that if we can get rid of that, let's do it, right? So that treatment might be effective just even in full-fledged adults. You might be able to do it, or you might, they can certainly screen for it in embryos right now, but let's say somebody still has it, it looks like they'll probably be able to eradicate it. So those are a few examples. There's many more things, and it doesn't have to be humans. It could be, I've given an example on a couple other podcasts of mosquitoes. Mosquitoes can kill humans, and they are now genetic engineering mosquitoes. They just released a whole batch of them, billions of them, I believe, in the Florida Keys, and they're going to drive out the bad mosquitoes that carry dengue and yellow fever and whatnot and hurt humans. And with these genetically modified mosquitoes, the coral reef is apparently being affected by global warming, and they feel like they can genetically modify coral to make it more resistant to warm water and release those coral and maybe save the whole reef. So there's tons of things that look very, very positive, and the future is wide. It's going to be a tsunami of scientific progress with major, major benefits for humans. No doubt about that.
But there's also the potential for disaster, because you're playing God.
Yeah.
You're playing God. And,
Yeah.
In some ways I can't help but question, something when it comes to reverse aging. Well, is that just an excuse to continue to live an unhealthy lifestyle? Because I mean, there's other cultures out there where people live well into their hundreds because the way their culture is, how they approach health and wellness. Certainly in North America, I think we've, there's a reason why we're fat and lazy, so being able to genetically alter your DNA, is that, giving people the excuse to not engage in healthy lifestyles?
Yeah, no, that's a very good point, Lucy. And also, even if you did engage in a healthy lifestyle and you maybe could have lived to 100, but instead now with genetic engineering, you can live till you have an accident or kill yourself.
Okay, but wait a second.
Could be 3,000 years.
I don't think our CPP could handle that.
Oh yeah, there you go. Let's not even talk about the financial.
For anyone outside of Canada, CPP is our, what is it considered, our government pension program?
It's the public pension. Yeah, so something like CPP would have to be completely restructured. In fact, I don't even know if it might actually be wound down, because nobody would have to
you live too
retire. Nobody would be too old, right, to retire, right? That's just one of the societal effects right there. It's an economic societal effect, but more so like a psychological effect. Imagine if you knew you would live, until maybe several hundred years. If I knew that, I probably wouldn't have written my novel, because I know I'm getting older and I wanted to do something. And, like there's sort of an urgency as you hit your 60s to do things and get things done, because, you're not going to live for another 100 years, right? So you never know, you could die tomorrow, right? So, but with living forever, in my novel, it's not a bowl of cherries. I have the great thing about novels that you can bring forth characters and show the reader how they feel and how they're adjusting and their struggles and all that. And I have a couple of characters who really have problems with living. My novel stretches 200 years from when they start the anti-aging, and then so people have lived. Some of them, like there's one old guy in my novel named Jesus, ironically, who's a Buddhist and a very thoughtful guy. He's 76 years old when he stops his aging. So he doesn't get any older, but he doesn't get any younger either. And he has to live like that for another 200 years. He's pretty frail. And he has a lot of reservations with it. And he's sort of the philosopher in the novel.
So in your novel, do you explore any sort of negative use of altering genetics? Yeah,
for sure. A lot of them. So a lot of this one character I mentioned, the philosophizer, he talks about natural selection, how there won't be any natural selection if we don't have natural selection works when individuals and species die, and then their genes are passed on through procreation, right? If you don't have generations, you will not have any more natural selection. It'll all be unnatural selection done by humans. So you can say goodbye to that natural process. And so he's a biologist. He's always thinking about those things. But there's also, if you think about it, if everybody could be with reverse aging, especially if you could pick your age, most people would probably pick 25 to 30. But I don't think the government would allow them to pick 12. So in my novel, you have to be at least 25, and most people just fix in at 25 or 30. So if that's the case, you're not going to have any old people, and you won't have any young people because the population would explode if nobody dies. So you can't have too many births anymore, right? So, if I don't take for granted, and you probably don't either, or your listeners, the beauty of the relationships between grandmothers, mothers, granddaughters, parents, offspring. All those beautiful intergenerational linkages in my novel are go by the wayside, or start to go by the wayside. And one of the other characters in my novel is Ximena, who is 25, but she'll never be a mother, is stuck in that. She says, I'm stuck in one dimension, basically. And she laments that she won't have any children. And also her mother, who's one of the heroines of my novel, has disappeared because there's sort of a scandal there where they took her away, and so she's lost her mother and she'll never have a daughter. So.
Yeah, it does. And that's it, is that if you do stop the aging process, then in the same context, you kind of have to limit how many new lives are coming into the world, because where are you going to put everybody?
Exactly. Yeah. So if there's a saying, you got to be careful what you ask for, right? So
Yeah.
if you and I don't even know if they offered it to me. In my novel, it's offered free. There's no equity issues. They offer it free. It's actually an easy procedure. 25 minutes, go in there and get it done, like a haircut, and you stop aging. And then 200 years later in my novel, this heroine I mentioned, who was sort of kidnapped, the mother of Ximena, she invents age reversing. But she doesn't want to implement it. She doesn't want to release it to the world because she knows that there's just too many ethical and moral issues, and so they're quite upset with her when she doesn't release it.
And I guess ultimately, I have to ask, can it be weaponized?
It certainly can. Bill Gates, who I respect immensely, aside from some of the marital issues he had recently, but like as a thinker, Bill Gates has said, he's on record a few years ago, he said the number one thing that worries him is bioterrorism. He said the chances of a virus, this is before COVID, he said the chances of a natural virus are significant, which would impact the world. That's like a COVID thing. It's interesting he said that just a few years ago. But he said the chances of bioterrorism affecting the world are much greater in a major way.
And there are a lot of people that believe that what we're going through with COVID was manufactured, and whether it was released accidentally or accidentally on purpose. Yeah. There's a lot of evidence that points towards that.
Yeah, and that would be so horrible if that is true, and I don't know, but I'm hoping that's not true. But as I just said, the chances are that someone will try to weaponize something. Imagine creating something like COVID that's 100 times more contagious. I mean, this COVID took the world to its knees, almost like a World War III, right? And so, yeah, I'm concerned about that, but you know what? There's also research going on. Like I can just cite one very interesting study that just came out. It's called Anti-Crispr. So CRISPR is a technology that's used to genetic engineer some of these things I mentioned. But Anti-Crispr just came out of MIT. I think it's Dr. Chaudhry there, Amit Chaudhry. They've created a process that protects, it's almost works as an antidote to any genetic tampering or whatever. So I could see that being used as a safety mechanism. That's pretty cool too. So I mean, there's always technology and other positive technology that's used to fight negative technology. And I hope something like Anti-Crispr could give us some peace, a little bit more peace on that front.
So what does Anti-Crispr do? Does that basically flip the switch back on something?
No, I think that's more like another thing, which is called CRISPR on and CRISPR off, which just came out a couple months ago, and that's also very closely associated with MIT. It's called the Broad Institute. Oh, sorry, the Whitehead Institute. The Broad Institute was the previous study. So the Whitehead Institute, a lot of the MIT professors, though, are still involved in this. And that's CRISPR on, CRISPR off, where you can take a CRISPR procedure, genetic engineering, and then you reverse it, almost like undoing when you're editing a document. You do the undo because I didn't want to do that. So you just flip undo, right? Whereas this anti-CRISPR I'm talking about is more of a block, a protection against any CRISPR tampering in the first place.
Okay, so it's called what do I want to say science fiction wise? A force field.
Force field,
It's a force field that protects you.
Yeah, almost like a vaccine would work against the virus. Yeah.
Interesting. Now you said that you wrote this book. You said that you're in the 60s and you've recently written this book. What, because you're a professor?
I'm not a professor. I did do some teaching of biomechanics and physiology at the university level, but most of my teaching has actually been at a college here in Hamilton, a high school in Hamilton. And I taught the grade 11, grade 12 economics and math. And then I also taught some equivalent university economics that some of those students, like the AP economics and that. So yeah, so teaching is my main background though, yes.
So that's a very, to go from, a very sort of quantitative environment to a very creative environment writing the book. What was that journey like for you?
It was a long journey, very somewhat torturous actually, because when I came out of high school, I was supposed to be a math science guy, engineer. I actually went into engineering and I dropped out after a year. I was doing very well in the program, and but I was ashamed that I just felt like I didn't want to be there. So I dropped out. I upset my parents, I know, because they, there's sort of expectations and they're cheering for you. And then suddenly, what are you doing? You're dropping out. And I was supposed to be a very good student. And here I was, like, I couldn't handle it. No, it's not that I couldn't handle it. The mechanics of the courses, I just didn't see I didn't want to be dealing with these things. And so in the end, it was a very good decision for me because I went into teaching. And that was fantastic. It was much more human. I did all the coaching. I got to joke around with kids, but also work hard with kids and watch them improve and work with adolescents. And it was fantastic. It was the best decision I ever made. But it took me a while. It didn't come naturally as my math and science stuff. I had to learn how to teach, motivate kids, provide interesting lessons, and then do all the coaching and learn all that stuff. So it took a while, but once I did that, and that took about 10 years. So I was probably almost in my late 30s when I started thinking, yeah, this is me. This is great. I'm sort of in a group now. That's a long time for most people. Find themselves a little earlier than that. But once I did that, then I became more creative. I started doing art, acrylic art, which I really enjoy as a hobby. And then, more when I was about 50, I started writing this novel, researching and writing the novel.
How long did it take you to write it then?
It took me about 6 months of a couple hours a day to put together the first drafts. I could not get it published. I tried, but it was pretty tough being a first-time author. So that's okay. I sort of put it aside. I also wrote another book, which I'm still working on right now. It's a nonfiction book on running and training and coaching. So, but this fiction, I just left it on the back burner. And you know what? I think, Lucy, it was good luck that it wasn't published, because now, with it coming out now, I think genetic engineering is a much more top of mind, really exciting concept or topic. And and self-publishing is much easier. So I didn't even bother to reach out to any publishers. I just self-published it and just put it out there. I did have to update all the science, and I also had some editors look at it really carefully and make sure it was crafted, as best I could before I put it out finally this time.
Yeah, because if you'd put it out 10 years ago, it would have just been science fiction. Whereas, sure, now it's still science fiction, but it's way closer to reality.
I
It's
believe
way closer to possibility.
you are correct. And so I try to write it that way. And it's called speculative fiction, or actually on the science fiction front, sometimes they call it hard science fiction, where I'm not on another planet or dealing with aliens or anything fantasy like that. It's more like I'm literally trying to predict the future based on the current and progression of science that I see right now.
Hmm. Definitely a very interesting subject and full of possibilities, but also um, I think we have to be careful because ultimately, I think playing God can have some very dangerous side effects.
Yes, and for I guess if you don't mind me with a quote here for the
Please
more
do.
spiritual people out there, and I'm not a deeply religious doctrine person, but I am a C.S. Lewis. I've read some C.S. Lewis, and I just found it interesting that he's a Christian writer. And 80 years ago, he wrote a book called The Abolition of Man. I'm going to just put my glasses on because there's one quote there that I just cannot believe this gentleman wrote so long ago. And he said, it's in a book called The Abolition of Man, 1943. If any one age really attains by eugenics and scientific education the power to make its descendants what it pleases, then all humans who live after it are patients of that power, not stronger. And he also said, what we call man's power over nature turns out to be power exercised by some men over other men with nature as its instrument. This is so, oh, my headphones are falling off. That's so prophetic. I just cannot believe it just hits the nail right on the head right now with the concerns.
Yeah, and even in what we're dealing with COVID and everything, it's very insightful for having being written in 1943.
Yeah.
Like crazy. And I'm sure at the time people probably read it and thought, what are you smoking, dude? But now it makes perfect sense. It's like, of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah, and you don't have to be religious or Christian to think that way. You can just have to be a human to think that way, right? To
Oh, for
wonder.
sure. For sure.
And I do bring some politics in my book to make it a little more exciting. Jennifer Doudna, who won the Nobel Prize in 2020 with Emmanuel Charpentier, those two top-notch female researchers, Doudna's from UCLA and Charpentier is from Planck Institute in Europe. They got the Nobel for their work on the CRISPR genetic engineering. This is just a couple of years ago. And Jennifer Doudna said clearly that genetic engineering can be and will be used to change not just physical traits, but also psychological traits of humans. So I can give you one example. Probably on the positive side, there's a lot of research going on in depression right now. University College London, they just did a huge study, and they're sort of zeroed in on a bunch of the genes involved in chronic pain. And there's a study that just was released in New York, the Icahn Institute there, on bipolar disease. And they found a number of genes they had no idea were involved in bipolar. So there's about 60 genes that they've sort of zeroed in on, and some of them overlap, interestingly, with schizophrenia and with depression. So all those psychological things, and I could talk about other things like creativity. They're looking into with genetic engineering. Fearlessness you could look into with genetic engineering, and you can impact. All those things are possible, and it's like I say, it's all bets are off. We are literally going to be potentially changing humans, not nurturing them anymore, but changing human nature.
Yeah, and I think that's where the discomfort comes from is, if you're going to genetically alter somebody to be creative or to be fearless,
Mhm.
it's you don't for me, you don't have to genetically alter somebody. You just have to give them the space to do that.
Yeah.
give this space. I mean, why genetically alter somebody when, we can have more art in our schools
Right.
and
Yeah,
actually
exactly.
encourage children
Yep.
to be creative. I mean, I still remember here, when we moved to Nova Scotia was when we'd left Ontario. My son was 4 and did 4-year-old kindergarten. And when we came here, they don't have 4 and 5-year-old kindergarten. They just have, at 5, you have something called primary, which is not quite a full day of school, but almost a full day of school. And I remember walking into the classroom and it was just desks.
Oh, really?
And I looked at the teacher and I'm like, are you expecting my kid to sit at a desk all day?
Yeah.
I'm like, where's the paint?
Yeah.
Where's the paint station? Where's the sand pit? Kids are supposed to be eating glue in kindergarten, not sitting at a desk. And, I think it's those things. It's, well,
That's the nurture. That's the nurture,
yeah,
which we've
can we
tried to
not
do.
look at the nurture, which we don't have in our society? I mean, we don't even have something as simple as nurturing kids so that they understand their own self-worth, whether they can explore their purpose. We don't do any of that. Yet we're willing to default to, let's genetically engineer them differently.
That's the ball game. You're right. So nurturing, I mean, I think in all fairness, we have done some decent nurturing, like for example, in medical care and life expectancy and some education programs and things like that. We social services, and we've come a long way compared to say a couple 100 years ago, nurturing each other, but with all sorts of flaws, like you mentioned, and voids. But this human nature is a just completely different ballgame. It's even in athletics, like I'm going to predict right now that world records are going to fall because they are going to, just like they use steroids, they will be using genetic engineering for future athletes. And I think it's impossible to stop that because the drive is so large, and to succeed and to make the millions of dollars that can be earned in endorsements. Steroids has been a very difficult thing for the World Anti-Doping Agency, and WADA already has a policy on genetic engineering. They've created it a few years ago, bracing themselves.
Fascinating topic. Mark, if somebody's listening and they want to get in touch with you and get a copy of your book, what's the best place for them to do that?
Sure. So my book right now is an ebook, although I think I'm going to get a print book ready by next week. So I'm looking at both books. But anyway, for either book, I think you might have a link that they can see. But if not, if they just go to their favorite retailer like Amazon or Apple or Kobo or Indigo and type in the name of my book, which is Age-Decoded. There's a hyphen in there, Age-Decoded. It'll pop up there. It's got a beautiful blue cover designed by Penny Scottard from Hamilton, Ontario, an artist here. I just love the way she did that. And so they can see it there. And I think it costs $10 in the ebook. When the print book comes out, it's going to be a little more expensive. It'll be, I think, $20 because the costs are higher but anyway, that's how they can purchase the book if they like. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, if you're listening and you are looking at getting your copy of Mark's book, make sure you check out the show notes. I'm going to have some links in there. And Mark, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Lucy. I really enjoyed that, and I very much appreciate it. And thanks to the listeners, too.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Roller Coaster Podcast. Want to chat or share your ideas about today's show? Pop me an email at hello@therollercoasterpodcast.com. Don't forget to connect with me on Facebook and Instagram at The Roller Coaster Podcast. Our theme song, Roller Coaster, was performed by The Lucky Setback. Audio editing by the one and only Jeff Quigley of Quigley Creative.
Life is like a roller